52 years old, her hands worn down to sinew and callus, her dress threadbare at the seams, Magdalene Hayes stood before the abandoned blacksmith shop at the edge of Willow Creek, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1887, with exactly $2.30 in her coat pocket, money she had earned through laundry work and mending, penny by penny, over 3 grinding years. The town had cast her out when her husband, James, had disappeared under circumstances they would never publicly discuss, his reputation destroyed by accusations of theft that she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had lived beside him for 27 years, were utterly false. The forge had been shuttered for 5 years, its brick chimney cracked, its bellows rusted, its great anvil sitting silent in the dust like a monument to something dead. The town assessor, looking almost embarrassed by the transaction, accepted $2 for the entire property, as though the building itself had become contagious. Magdalene bought it anyway, walking into that dim interior with the deeds in her trembling hand, not because she believed she could resurrect it, but because something in her bones told her that this forge held more than rust, that behind the sealed iron door at the back of the workroom, there lay a truth that had been waiting 8 years to be found, a secret that would not merely restore her name to honor, but would shatter the lies that Willow Creek had built its own survival upon. Let us tell you the story of Magdalene Hayes, and what she discovered when she dared to open what the town had worked so hard to keep shut. If you are watching from a place where your name has been stolen, or where you have been cast out for speaking what you know to be true, we would very much like to hear your story in the comments. Magdalene had grown up in the blacksmith's daughter, in a town called Silver Falls, Wyoming, where the mountains held enough precious metal to keep 100 forges burning day and night. Her father, Thomas Hayes, had been not merely a blacksmith, but a master of the craft, a man whose hands understood metal the way a musician's hands understand strings, who could look at raw ore and see the shape of its destiny. He had taught Magdalene from the time she was 7 years old to read fire, to understand the precise orange-red glow that meant the metal was ready to yield, to hear the music in the hammer's strike. While her mother had wanted her to focus on the domestic arts, Magdalene's father had recognized something rarer, a gift for the work, an instinctive understanding of how heat and pressure could transform the world. By 15, she could forge a horseshoe as true and balanced as any man, and her father had begun to teach her the deeper secrets: how to read an ore sample, how to judge the quality of coal by its ash, how to spot the subtle impurities that could ruin an entire batch of metal. More than this, he had taught her that a blacksmith's work was not merely mechanical, it was a form of honesty. "Metal tells the truth," he would say, running his weathered finger across a finished piece. "You cannot deceive it. If your technique is true, and your patience is genuine, the metal will shine and hold. If you have cut corners or harbored meanness in your heart, it will show as a flaw." She had absorbed this philosophy along with the soot and heat, understanding that integrity was not separate from craftsmanship. They were the same thing, the one the outward expression of the other. She had met James Hayes at 20, when he had come to her father's forge with a special commission, hinges for a new bank building being constructed in Silver Falls. James was the assistant manager of that bank, a meticulous man who kept accounts with obsessive precision, who believed that honesty in financial matters was the foundation upon which civilization rested. They had married within a year, and had moved to Willow Creek when James had been offered a position as the chief bookkeeper for the Copper Mountain Mining Cooperative, a consortium of 8 mining claims that fed the prosperity of the entire region. Magdalene had supported him in the move, though it meant leaving her father's forge behind. She had found work almost immediately. The territory had no other qualified blacksmith, and the forges in Copper Mountain's operations needed constant maintenance and specialty work. For 17 years, she and James had built a life together. They had no children, but they had had each other's respect, and they had had the respect of the community. Magdalene had earned a reputation as the finest craftsperson in 3 counties. Mining companies would send work to her specifically, knowing that whatever came from her anvil would be built to last. James had earned a similar reputation for financial acuity and scrupulous honesty. Together, they had seemed untouchable. Then, in the spring of 1879, everything had changed in the space of a single audit. A discrepancy had been discovered in the Copper Mountain Mining Cooperative's accounts. A staggering sum, nearly $40,000, unaccounted for over a 5-year period. An investigation had been opened. By the end of that investigation, James Hayes had been publicly accused of embezzlement, of systematic theft, disguised within the ledger lines of his own meticulous handwriting. The evidence had seemed airtight. His signature appeared on authorizations for payments that had never been received. His explanations for the discrepancies had been treated as the desperate lies of a caught criminal. He had protested his innocence with a quiet dignity that the town had interpreted as arrogance. 3 months after the accusation, James had left Willow Creek in the dead of night, not because he was guilty, but because he understood that truth had become irrelevant. No one would believe him. The cooperative's board of directors, led by the wealthy and politically connected Victor Ashford, had closed ranks and made it clear that they wanted the scandal contained and the matter considered resolved. James's departure had served that purpose perfectly. Magdalene had stayed. She had refused to abandon the town or the business she had built, believing that her own reputation and her own work would eventually speak louder than the lies. She had been wrong. The same companies that had once competed for her work had quietly stopped commissioning her. The forge, which had been so busy that she had sometimes worked 16-hour days, had grown silent. Families that had known her for 2 decades had stopped greeting her on the street. When she had tried to explain that James was innocent, that she was certain there was another explanation, people had listened with barely concealed pity, the kind of pity reserved for those who were willfully blind or deliberately complicit. 3 years of dwindling work had left her with nothing. The forge had closed. The house had been seized to pay legal fees. She had moved into a rented room in the poorest part of town and had taken whatever work she could find: laundry, mending, cooking in the boarding house kitchen. She had saved every cent she could, but she had not known what she was saving for. She had only known that she could not leave, could not abandon the place where her good name had been destroyed, could not stop believing that eventually, somehow, the truth would rise to the surface like ore from the ground. When she learned that the old blacksmith shop had been abandoned and was being sold for taxes, something in her had moved toward action. The shop had belonged to a man named Marcus Tinsley, who had operated it for 10 years before the business had failed, and he had departed for California in 1882. No one had wanted to buy the property. It carried the burden of failure, the sense that it was cursed. The building had sat empty for 5 years, slowly deteriorating, a monument to defunct ambition. Magdalene had walked into the assessor's office with her $2.30 and had stated, with a quiet clarity that had surprised both herself and the assessor, that she wanted to buy the forge. The assessor had barely blinked. "Done," he had said, sliding the deed across the desk. "You're welcome to it. God knows what you'll do with it. But at least someone's taking it off the county's hands." She had spent her first week simply cleaning, removing years of accumulated dust and debris, discovering the scope of the decay. The bellows were beyond repair. The anvil was cracked. The tools that had been left behind were rusted beyond utility. But as she worked, moving methodically through the space, she had noticed something odd. A heavy iron door at the back of the workroom, behind where the forge itself had sat. The door was secured with a padlock, and the padlock was new, far newer than the 5 years the building had sat empty. Someone had maintained that lock, had kept renewing it, preventing access to whatever lay behind it. Magdalene had studied the door for a long moment, understanding that she had stumbled upon a secret, and understanding that discovering it might be the first step toward understanding everything else. She had used a crowbar to break the lock, applying force with the kind of controlled strength that her years at the forge had taught her. The padlock had given way, and the heavy door had swung inward, revealing a room she had never known existed. It was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a single window that had been boarded over from the inside, and it was filled with ledgers, rows and rows of leather-bound account books, stacked on wooden shelves, organized by year and date. Her hands had trembled as she had pulled the first ledger from the shelf and opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content was clear. Detailed records of mining operations, production figures, asset valuations, and, most damningly, a parallel set of accounts that diverged wildly from any official records she had ever seen. The figures showed systematic diversion of funds, unauthorized payments, sales of mining equipment to shell companies, the pocketing of profits that should have been distributed to all 8 members of the cooperative equally. Magdalene had spent 3 days simply reading, cross-referencing, making notes. The dates were unmistakable. The theft had begun in 1874, 5 years before James had been accused. The handwriting on the authorization documents was similar enough to James's, to someone unfamiliar with true penmanship. But now that she could see them side by side, the differences were obvious. The thief had been trying to imitate James's hand, but had made subtle errors. A T that was too tall, an R that curved the wrong way, a flourish that James never used. Someone had committed a massive crime and then had methodically attempted to frame an innocent man. Someone had been living with these secrets, hidden in this room for 8 years, maintaining the lock, ensuring that no one would ever find the truth. And Magdalene understood, with a certainty that felt like ice water running through her veins, exactly who that someone was. Victor Ashford, the board's chairman, the man who had orchestrated James's destruction, was the thief. The ledgers proved it, beyond any shadow of doubt. The handwriting on the ledgers, when she compared it carefully to documents she had seen over the years, matched Victor Ashford's own writing perfectly. And there was more. Hidden in a compartment beneath the lowest shelf, she found letters, correspondence between Ashford and a mining company official in Denver, detailing how the stolen copper and silver were being sold to private buyers, how the profits were being laundered through legitimate businesses. There was also a ledger in a different hand, clearly belonging to the previous blacksmith, Marcus Tinsley, documenting his discovery of Ashford's activities, his attempts to confront Ashford, and ultimately, his decision to hide the evidence and flee rather than face what Ashford was clearly capable of. Marcus had left a handwritten note tucked into the final ledger. "I fear for my life. Victor Ashford is a man without conscience. These documents prove his crimes, but they will cost him everything, and I have not the courage to bear the consequences of exposure. I leave this evidence here, hidden, hoping that someday someone braver than I will find it and use it to restore justice. Forgive me for my cowardice." Magdalene had sat in that hidden room, surrounded by the proof of her husband's innocence and the evidence of a crime so vast that it had stolen not merely money, but people's lives, and she had wept. She had wept for Marcus's fear. She had wept for James's destroyed reputation. She had wept for the 8 years she had spent living under a cloud of suspicion and shame. And then she had dried her tears, had photographed each page of the most incriminating ledgers with the careful hand camera she had purchased years ago, and had begun to plan. She did not immediately go to the authorities. Instead, she had made copies of the most essential documents, had written detailed letters explaining the evidence and its location, and had sent these letters to the territorial marshal, to the board members of the Copper Mountain Cooperative, and to the editor of the Willow Creek Gazette. She had acted with the methodical precision that her father had taught her, carefully, without emotion, letting the truth speak for itself. The response had been swift but complicated. The territorial marshal had wanted to act immediately, but the political powers in Willow Creek had moved to suppress the investigation. Victor Ashford, after all, was influential. He had money. He had connections. He had denied everything, had claimed that the ledgers were fraudulent, that Magdalene had fabricated them in a desperate attempt to rehabilitate her criminal husband. He had powerful allies who had believed him. For a brief, terrible moment, it had seemed as though the truth would be buried again, as it had been buried 8 years ago. But Magdalene had been patient, and she had been methodical, and she had understood something about how the world actually worked. She had invited each of the other 7 members of the cooperative to the hidden room to examine the evidence for themselves. One by one, they had come. One by one, they had read the ledgers with their own eyes, and had understood that they had been defrauded of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The unity that had protected Ashford had begun to crack, and once it had cracked, it had shattered entirely. The territorial marshal had returned with legal authority. The ledgers had been seized as evidence. An investigation had been reopened, and this time, with the direct participation of the defrauded members of the cooperative, the truth could not be suppressed. Victor Ashford had faced trial in the spring of 1888. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. The handwriting experts had confirmed that the documents bearing his signature were genuine. His own correspondence with the Denver Mining Company had damned him utterly. He had been convicted of embezzlement and fraud on a massive scale and had been sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. The sentence had been served quietly, without the drama and publicity that had attended James's accusation. This was the kind of justice that came quietly, almost without fanfare, the kind that the powerful preferred to keep hidden, since it reflected so poorly on those who had believed them in the first place. James had learned of his vindication in a letter that Magdalene had written to him at the address he had left with her, a place in Denver where he was living under an assumed name, broken by what he had experienced. He had returned to Willow Creek in the autumn of 1888, and the town that had cast him out had slowly, awkwardly, begun to restore him to its good graces. There had been no public apology, no formal rehabilitation. Instead, there had been quiet shifts. People who had avoided him had begun to nod in greeting again. Business opportunities that had dried up had begun to reappear. Magdalene had worked with the board of the cooperative to ensure that the stolen funds that were recovered were distributed equitably to those who had been defrauded, and that part of that recovery went to helping other businesses in the town that had suffered during the years of Ashford's theft. She had used her portion to rebuild the blacksmith shop, and within 2 years, it had become profitable again, busier than ever, filled with the work of people who understood that the woman who ran it had risked everything to tell the truth. Magdalene Hayes had learned, in those long years between her husband's accusation and his vindication, that the world does not always reward honesty, but that honesty is still worth maintaining. She had learned that sometimes the truth is hidden, not because it cannot be found, but because powerful people work very hard to ensure that no one looks for it. She had learned that her father's wisdom, that metal tells the truth if you know how to read it, applied to human nature as well. The flaws in Ashford's character had always been there. They had simply been hidden, carefully concealed behind wealth and respectability and social position, just as the ledgers had been hidden behind the sealed iron door. But just as metal, no matter how carefully worked, will show its true composition to someone who knows how to examine it, so too will human truth eventually reveal itself to those patient enough to listen. When people asked her how she had known to buy that abandoned forge, Magdalene would smile and say that sometimes the universe puts us exactly where we need to be, and that the only requirement is to show up and look carefully at what others have written off as worthless. The forge had been worthless to most people. It was broken, abandoned, a failure, but it had contained everything necessary to restore justice to a man who had been destroyed by lies, to reclaim the reputation of a woman who had refused to accept false shame, and to begin the long process of healing a community that had allowed itself to believe in an easy narrative because examining the truth would have required too much effort. Magdalene had done the hard work. She had done it alone, with only her own stubborn belief that honesty meant something. And when the truth had finally emerged, it had done so with the kind of force that comes from something long buried, suddenly breaking free. She lived in Willow Creek for another 43 years after that autumn, when she first opened the sealed door. She died in 1931, at the age of 96, having spent those 4 decades as the most respected craftsperson in the territory, having helped train a new generation of blacksmiths, having maintained her marriage to James with a tenderness born of having fought for it and won. The blacksmith forge that she had bought for $2 became a landmark, a place where people came not merely to have their tools mended, but to remember a story about what persistence and integrity could accomplish. The hidden room behind the iron door was eventually opened to public tours, and visitors would stand in that small space, surrounded by the ledgers that had changed everything, and would understand, in a way that no speech or sermon could convey, the power of evidence, the courage required to speak truth, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had been willing to wait, to work, and to believe that someday, somehow, the world would recognize what she had always known. So when we tell you that Magdalene Hayes paid $2 for a broken blacksmith forge that everyone else had written off as worthless, we are telling you something about the nature of value itself. Value does not reside in what others can see. It resides in what lies beneath, in what must be searched for with patience and care, in what has been deliberately hidden because it threatens the comfortable lies we have chosen to believe. Magdalene understood this not as an abstract principle, but as a lived reality. She had learned it from her father at the forge, where she had watched raw ore transform into instruments of precision and beauty. She had learned it from her husband's destruction, which had taught her that reputation is fragile and easily shattered by those with power. And she had learned it from the hidden ledgers, which had taught her that truth does not disappear when powerful people work to bury it. It only waits, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to open the door. Thank you for spending this time with us. We know that you're watching from 1,000 different places, carrying your own stories of injustice, your own experiences of being written off or overlooked or misunderstood by the people around you. We want to hear those stories. If you have ever stood up to defend someone you loved, despite the cost to yourself, if you have ever found value in something the world had deemed worthless, if you have ever had to fight for your own vindication in the face of powerful opposition, please share that with us in the comments. Before you go, we would like to ask you this. What is something precious that you once wrote off as worthless, only to discover later its true value? What sealed door in your own life are you afraid to open, and what might be hidden behind it? Until next time, stay close to the truth, and know that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look.